Okay, we might get started. I think there's quite a few people here already, and we'll welcome people as they join us. So thank you and hello and welcome to this webinar series exploring the main findings and themes in creating our future, the fourth and most recent National Arts Participation Survey. My name is Lena Stein and I'm a research associate here at the Australia Council for the Arts. To visually describe myself, I'm a woman with olive skin and dark hair wearing a top with a flower print, and in the room behind me is some art on the walls. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which I'm coming to you from, the lands of the Wadi Wadi and Darawal people. I'd also like to acknowledge the many nations throughout Australia that we're gathering from, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge all First Nations people present and online in this session today. The National Arts Participation Survey, which began in 2009 and runs every 3 to 4 years, is a landmark research series undertaken by the Australia Council that explores Australians' engagement and attitudes towards the arts. And one of the main themes in the most recent research tells us that Australians are increasingly and more than ever before recognising the positive impact of arts and creativity on our health and well-being. It's also important to say that this discussion may cover some difficult topics. If at any time during the conversation today you're finding the discussion difficult or stressful, you're very welcome to take a break and come back. We do want to have a positive conversation. We also understand that we're living in challenging times. So first and foremost, it's important to take care of ourselves. The Support Act helpline and lifeline details will also be added to the chat box. So here to explore this topic today is Rebecca Mostyn, Director of Research here at the Australia Council, Ian Drayton, Deputy Director of Innovation and Business Development at the University of Canberra, also Churchill Fellow and former serving member of the Australian Defence Force. And we also have Frances Robinson, who is a Capacity Building Project Officer here at Council, who oversees our Future Leaders program. So this is a timely topic to discuss as we've faced a particularly difficult 2020. In the months that followed the data collection for the survey last year, Australia faced a devastating summer of bushfires, followed by the momentous disruption, isolation and anxiety of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, amongst this, arts and creativity have played an invaluable role in supporting the well-being of Australians during this time. And while the survey results provide a benchmark of Australians' arts engagement before the impacts of the pandemic, they also provide a great deal of evidence to the substantial positive effects of the arts and creativity to our mental and physical health overall, as well as the intersection of the arts sector with the health and wellbeing sector, which is going to be increasingly important as we individually and collectively recover and our nation looks to the future. So before I hand you over to Rebecca to lead the discussion, I'd just like to give you a brief overview of some of the key health and wellbeing statistics in creating our future. So over half of Australians agree that arts and creativity have a big or very big impact on our sense of wellbeing and happiness, which has increased 11 percentage points since 2016. And more than half of Australians also now believe that the arts help us to deal with stress, anxiety and depression. And more than half also agree that the arts allow them to connect with others, with connection being a key driver of arts attendance. 1 in 4 Australians, or 25%, attend the arts specifically to improve their well-being, and more than 2/3 agree that the arts make for a richer and more meaningful life. Now, these strong findings don't exist in isolation. The data also aligns with other findings internationally. The World Health Organization recently published a paper collating evidence from over 3,000 studies of the effects of the arts and creativity to help meet challenges to our health and well-being, such as aging, loneliness, chronic conditions, our mental and physical health, and improving our quality of life. And results from the review found evidence of the benefits of the arts and creativity to prevention and treatment of health concerns, such as encouraging healthy living due to improved general self-perceived health, and supporting child development, such as speech development, to affecting the social determinants of health, such as social cohesion and social inequality, and helping people experiencing mental illness, including recovery from trauma and abuse. So I'll hand over to Rebecca to start the conversation. But before I do, a quick note: if you'd like to ask a question of our panel today, please feel free to start sending questions through to the Q&A box on Zoom. The chat function is also there for you to use for general discussion throughout, but we'll be taking questions from the Q&A section. And on to that. Thank you, Rebecca.
I'll mute first. Thank you, Lena, and hello everyone. I'm Rebecca Mostyn, Director of Research here at the Australia Council. And for those who are visually impaired, I'm a woman with fair skin and mid-brown wavy hair. I'm wearing glasses and a dark patterned top, and I'm in a room with cushions and a curtain behind me. And a big welcome and thank you to Ian and Francis for being part of this discussion today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from today, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people joining this conversation. So yes, please feel free to start putting questions in the Q&A box. As Lena said, the chat's there and I can see people are using it. Preferably if you could put your questions in the Q&A box, that's where we'll be looking. But I will kick off the questions for Ian and Francis. Ian, firstly, this is a really great opportunity for us to hear your perspective as a former serving member of the Australian Defence Force. You've been doing a lot of work, I know, to understand and deliver the benefits of creative arts for trauma recovery, resilience and teamwork. Can you talk to us a bit about your experience with arts and creativity in the health and wellbeing space?
Sure, thanks Rebecca. Yeah, so just to start, just for those visually impaired, I'm obviously a male by the sound of my voice. 59 years old, grey hair, attempted a goatee and brown skin. Okay, so to answer the question, yeah, thanks Rebecca. My involvement with the Australian Defence Force creative program, I worked with the Australian Defence Force back in 2014 to create what we now call the Arts for Recovery, Resilience, Teamwork and Skills program. So that's been a program we've run here at the University of Canberra for the last, well, since 2015 now. And we have run 2 month-long intensive creative workshops for current serving, wounded, injured and ill Defence personnel, predominantly those suffering from traumatic experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder, and with most of those coming out of the Middle East, the current operations in the Middle East. And we used a series of creative workshops in creative writing, in the visual arts and in performance and music to help people tell their stories. It's not, importantly for us, and the distinction that we have is that it's not art therapy. Our program is supported by defence psychologists, but we run the projects with artistic mentors, not art therapists. And we've actually found that that's been through defence science, technology, psych research and our own research, we've actually found that to be really successful. And coming out of that program, I won a Churchill Fellowship in 2016 and worked with the US and the UK military and also emergency services, particularly with fireys in New York from 9/11 who are using the creative arts. And I found that the creative arts in both the UK and the US are really heavily embedded in the whole healthcare continuum for those populations, as against here, where we're still babes in the woods, so to speak. Back to you, Rebecca.
Right, thank you so much, Ian. And Francis, you're a champion of wellbeing access and inclusion at the Australia Council, as well as overseeing some of the leadership programs. Can you talk a bit about your experience around the arts and health and wellbeing?
Hi, thanks Rebecca, and nice to be joining you here today. I'd like to begin also by extending my acknowledgement of country. I'm calling in from Gadigal country here in Sydney in the Eora Nation, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to just quickly audio describe myself. I am a fair-skinned woman with blondie brown hair, in my early 30s, and today wearing a black jumper, sitting in my living room. There's some artwork on the walls behind me and some plants. But yeah, it's a great privilege to be here joining this conversation today. My experience, I've been at council for the last 2 years, and in that time I've been working in the capacity building team for that whole time, and just recently been looking after the Future Leaders program, which is our program for our emerging leaders in the first 10 years of their career. We bring together people from across the sector, from across the country, and also the Indo-Pacific region. I know there's a few future leaders in the group today, so welcome, thanks for being here. Our general approach to leadership is, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey over the last 2 years. People, we find, more and more are not associating with the word leadership anymore. We have sort of inherent ideas about what that might mean in a hierarchical sort of white male model. But our leadership programs are different to that. We encourage people to come to our programs as their whole selves. Similar to how sort of Ian was talking about, we use sort of arts and creativity and the importance of place and space to prompt reflection at our residentials. So our Future Leaders program is made up of 2 residentials where people, a group of 25 leaders from across the country and across the sector come together to learn on country. It's important that we get out of our day-to-day environment and we work in regional and remote areas for these residentials and think about the importance of learning from country and from elders in those spaces. We're very privileged to be able to do so. I think the interesting thing about our leadership program is that the inherent ability to connect people. And actually so many people say that probably the most important thing that came from this program for them was the connection or the network with others, which for me just speaks so greatly to the importance of connection to our health and well-being. Similarly, we run an alumni network program now where we're thinking about the last 3 years of our leadership programs and how we connect people together cross cohorts and cross year groups and cross arts leaders, future leaders programs to build that stronger connection as well. Recently, we launched the alumni network by running a jumpy desert weavers weaving circle, which was so largely about connecting rather than there being any outcomes or sort of inherent purpose to the work. It was about being together in a space and again learning from our First Nations elders. We ran this session via Zoom, and we were so lucky to be able to connect with elders from Warracoona in sort of remote Western Australia. So while we were sort of thousands of miles apart, we somehow felt more connected than ever. And I think that just speaks greatly to building health and well-being within ourselves. So I also just wanted to touch briefly on the fact that my experience from the last 10 years has largely been in volunteer management. And I was sort of reflecting on this last night, working across festivals and galleries. And the reason I care so deeply about volunteerism, being inclusive and accessible to all, sort of, again, is what I see in our leadership programs and the importance of volunteerism and the importance of all of these things that we do in capacity building is about bringing people together and it being one of the greatest connectors. I think bringing people together around common purpose really is the main driver for me as to what helps support our well-being and our wellness.
Thanks, Frances. And Ian, you've talked about some of the programs that you've been involved in. Would you be able to share any examples of how you've seen the arts support mental health and recovery from trauma from the work you've done, or from other programs that you're aware of in Australia or overseas?
Yeah, I've talked about our defence program, but I'll sort of diversify from that. I'm quite passionate about regional Australia and the work that regional Australians do, coming from regional Australia myself. So We won some funding back in 2018 to conduct some workshops and creative workshops for communities under stress from drought at the time that were suffering severe drought at the end of 2018. And we chose a place called Custodianship, which is just about an hour and a half west of Forbes in central New South Wales. Our program, we ran visual arts and creative arts workshops out there, and we had a fantastic response from a community of 3,000 people in Condo. And we've also extended that, we ran a second project out there at the end of 2019, in November last year actually, just before these fires took effect. And again, with a lot of success, and we've now received some funding, and she won't mind me saying, but we've actually been successful in receiving some funding from Magda Zabansky, who raised funds during the bushfires, her and Will Connolly, for community recovery from bushfires. So we're about to start a program in the Southern Snowies in the Churchill region. So the money that we've been awarded by Magda is to run 3 programs, one in Southern New South Wales in the Batlow region. We're looking at one in Corryong in northern Victoria, and one on Kangaroo Island in South Australia. We've also, that's those programs, so certainly disaster recovery is an area we've worked in. Another one that I think has been particularly interesting is we've done some work with the Australian Aboriginal Women's Choir in Central Australia. Morris Stewart is the director there, and we've looked at how, from a wellbeing perspective, the ladies involved, the Indigenous ladies involved in the choir, anecdotally have had longer lives and are receiving less or pursuing less sort of clinical medical treatments over their life compared to their peers. So we're sort of seeing that just that work that they've been doing with Morris in the Central Indigenous Choir has been really, really successful. So there's sort of a few. I've got examples all over the place, but there's a few examples.
Thank you. And is there anything you're able to share, maybe with some of the Defence Forces or the emergency services, where we've actually kind of seen results from some of this work?
Oh, look, again, we currently have 2 PhD students on our Defence Arts program. One is a psychologist doing a quantitative analysis of the program, and one is an artist who's doing a qualitative analysis. So there's been just recently a paper published in the Journal for Veterans and Defence Military Medicine, and Tavis has studied the long-term effects of doing the Defence Arts program over a range of psychometric measures over a period of 48 months. So we're actually seeing that participants, the majority of participants in the arts who did our arts program back in 2015, 2016, are having benefits and continuing to have benefits out to 2020, where they're well above baseline levels. So we've been doing sort of pre and post surveys of participants.
Well, I think we might have been frozen. Okay, we might come back to you, Ian. You seem to have frozen, so I'll go back to you, Francis. Are you able to share examples around programs or activities that you've seen to support wellbeing or resilience, whether it's artists themselves or beyond, artists working with people to support their wellbeing and resilience?
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Yeah, no, I sort of wanted to expand just also briefly on the idea of our leaders bringing their whole selves as well to their programs, because I think this is another aspect which sort of validates and identifies the fact we're not just leaders of our organizations, or we're not just leaders in our art sector space. We're also leaders within our community, within our family, within, you know, if you're the primary caregiver for a child or an elderly parent, you know, what sort of inherent qualities are you also bringing to the program through bringing your whole self? And I think, you know, the strength of the program, again, like I mentioned, is about bringing this network of connected people together to build their resilience together, and to have a collective unified voice and to be stronger together. And I'm just such a big advocate for that in this moment. I think more than ever we need to be thinking about how we can do things more collectively. An example that I have, which maybe doesn't speak directly to wellbeing and resilience, but I think it's possibly an outcome of, was I was at Meeting Place, which is the National Arts and Disability Conference in 2019 in Canberra. And I also should just identify as a non-disabled person myself, having the privilege to be able to join this conversation. There was a workshop that I joined that was being run by Kath Duncan and Maddie Little, who had been working on this large program called The Last Avant-Garde, which, if you haven't looked at their research, I really encourage you to do so. But they talked a lot about slow time and quick trust, which has really resonated with me and the work that we do. It sort of talks to doing things at a pace that works for everyone rather than a pace that is expected, and taking everyone's time constraints into account. So a way that we I could see the parallels between how we run our leadership programs and the effect that it has on people's well-being and resilience and building trust within a group is asking everyone in the room what their learning access needs are, not just making assumptions about, the way people will engage with each other or expecting people to behave in a particular way, but actually being transparent about that at the beginning, which, the ability to be able to participate and feel respected and valued and included, I think, is central to our well-being, and also central to our leadership programs. So by doing so, you see the benefits and the outcomes of the well-being through the group as they slowly take the time to build that trust together. And another thing that at the end of our leadership programs, our participants have scope to apply for small seed funding through a collaboration fund grant. So a really interesting grant that came recently. I think Ian's just joined us back by mobile. That came out from the Resilience Fund, but also through a collaboration fund and a secondment through our leadership programs, is this idea of validating and valuing rest and actually demanding rest. So I think it's only once you've built that space and trust and time has been opened up that we can really take the time to look inwards and reflect more deeply on ourselves and what we need and how to negotiate and communicate what we need. And I can't remember who said it, so I apologize for not being able to credit this person, but I think it was at the town halls last week as part of the consultation, somebody posed the provocation, how can rest be a revolutionary act? And I think something that we need to be thinking more of during this time where COVID has forced us to slow down is thinking about rest as inherent and necessary, and something that supports our well-being and builds our resilience. Rest is necessary.
Yeah. Thank you, Frances. Good point. There's lots of, it feels like there's lots of lived experience and increasing kind of evidence about how arts and creativity can support health and well-being. Ian, how do we convince the health sector? How do we get a seat at that? It's kind of coming up in our Q&A box as well.
Yeah, look, that's a really... Can you hear me, Rebecca? Just because I've rejoined on my mobile. Apologies. Obviously, it's my end that had a problem. Look, that is a really interesting question. And when I was on my Churchill Fellowship in Washington, I had a meeting with the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, with a neuroscientist there who was also a musician. And I said to him, from a university perspective, how do we get more funding in this sort of creative health space? And he definitely said that from his experience, to that joining qualitative or that blending of qualitative and quantitative to overarch sort of our applications with a scientific overlay, but underpinned by the creative. So that's certainly something I'm trying and endeavouring to do from our perspective here at the university. The other thing is, I'm sure, I think through education and policy interventions or environments, and how do we communicate, or sorry, how do we educate clinicians, public health specialists and other clinical professionals around the evidence-based and practical application of the arts. So I'd really like to see how, it's not an answer, I'm sorry, Rebecca, but it's really about getting into, a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is get into the ears of the policymakers. And I literally had a meeting last week with a medical practitioner here who is using the creative narrative in her practice. So I think in the longer term, it's about getting some form of creative educational experience for clinicians during their training so that they have an appreciation of the creative as they go forward.
So do you think it's maybe a bit of a combination? I guess we've been focused on providing evidence for quite a while, and there is a lot of building evidence, but it's also about telling those specific stories and getting in early.
Yeah, look, absolutely. In my experience with defence, you would think, if anything, defence would not be necessarily attuned to the creative side of their workforce. But I'm actually finding they are, and becoming more and more so. In fact, they're using creativity now to build resilience in their workforce. When I say their workforce, I'm talking about, defence personnel, and ways to overcome. I mean, for example, Australia's Special Forces soldiers have actually SAS soldiers actually take visual art materials, so drawing materials, into the front line with them, so that they actually use, whilst they're not necessarily in battle, obviously, but when they're on the front line and they have some downtime, they're actually using creative materials to document their experiences through drawing.
And have you heard any kind of responses from the soldiers themselves about that?
Yeah, a lot use it. A lot of finding that back in not long after September 11, when we were deployed into the Middle East, about the only outlet for defence personnel on sometimes 9 and 12 months deployments in the Middle East was weights, doing weights in a weight room in a gym. Whereas now a lot of them are actually doing creative activities. So I spoke to the National Endowment for the Arts in the US when I was in the US, and they've actually got people on the ground deployed with US forces around teaching soldiers the use of creative arts whilst they're on deployment, and it's working really, really well. I mean, I've had a number of soldiers come up to me, several years after doing the arts program, and literally saying that they're alive because of the arts. They've got no question in their mind that they would have committed suicide had it not been for their understanding and their use of the creative arts in their recovery.
Oh, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it doesn't get more powerful.
And I sense that I think you mentioned earlier that in other countries like the US, this is more integrated. That do you think could we take some learnings from how other countries have been able to embed kind of creative practice within those areas of health and wellbeing and trauma?
Look, absolutely. Obviously scale is a different thing. I mean, the scale in the US and also the UK, in terms of the numbers of people that have been deployed into the Middle East, far exceed those that Australians have. So there's certainly a scale issue, but I certainly see there's more appetite for the decision makers within the health sector, within the military, in those environments, to actually have arts as a part of the recovery mechanism. And as I said, we've been running our program now for 6 years with the Australian Defence Force, which has been absolutely brilliant. But it's still out on the periphery. We're getting there. We're chipping away. And only recently, quite literally in the last 12 months, the funding that we have for our defence program has now come under Health Command. What that means is that we're now part of the human performance area within the Australian Defence Force. So where it was out on the periphery 6 years ago, it's now, I wouldn't say it's central, but it's very much a recognised part of the human performance area, soldier performance, which is great.
Yeah, that sounds like progress.
I think you. I think I might have frozen again.
No, we're all good. We heard you.
Okay.
I did. Hopefully everyone else did too. I might come back to you, Francis, now just to let's just talk maybe about the opportunity for partnerships. And I know the leadership programs often draw on partnerships, and kind of, do you have any thoughts about how arts play a leadership role in the broader national recovery around health and wellbeing, and how maybe the potential for partnerships to kind of support that?
Yeah, could I just also, just on Ian's point as well, just follow on just quickly, if that's all right, about the, I think the importance of partnerships, particularly with the health sector, you know, and how we can have a seat at that table. But because, you know, from the report, we can see that the arts can save future expenditure on health services and social care, as we read in the report, and how in the UK, the doctors are literally prescribing arts experiences, which I think is incredible. You know, that's and I don't think we should discount you know, art therapy, and it's certainly been something that I've been hearing coming up more than once in the sector consultation over the past couple of weeks. You know, I think also it's you know, we need to also better understand and be able to communicate our value and worth. And in many ways stop downplaying that worth. You know, something that I was reflecting on last night is, and I hear people say in the arts, and I've been also known to say myself as well, we're not saving lives, you know. And Ian just gave us an incredible example of the fact that we are, but, you know, even though we're not on the front line and we're not doctors and we're not literally there saving lives, I think the stats from this report really speak to the importance of arts and creativity and what it has on our ongoing and sustained mental health and well-being. So in many ways, maybe we are, but we just don't see the immediate effects of that. So I think it's important to not downplay our value and to actually talk about it a bit more. But in terms of partnerships and leveraging other partnerships, I think there's absolutely places that we can be looking to in aged care, correctional services, the NDIS, private health, and all of these areas, you know, to think about where we can work together. And again, it comes back to that idea of collaboration and being able to meet each other halfway, and acknowledging that we need to, you know, we all need to exist and recover together. And so how can we do that? An example that I have of a really beautiful program that I actually participated in London when I was living there was this program called Cocktails in Care Homes. And it was just, you know, a pretty under-resourced volunteer-led program, which just had such huge, big impact on people's lives. And I, as a volunteer, would attend my local care home in Southeast London once a month to have conversations with elderly people who maybe didn't have visitors come to see them. And you know, the impact of what I could see for that community was just so, you know, I would leave going, wow, I feel great. I feel like, you know, we've had a fantastic night together. It felt like a party where people were invited to get up and dance if they wanted to. They could sing. There was sometimes a volunteer that would bring an instrument to play, and it was just such a powerful act, and such a moment where we know that, you know, arts and dementia are intrinsically linked, and the benefits of arts and creativity for people who have dementia is really helpful in recalling memory and all sorts of things. So I think we should absolutely be thinking about strategic and innovative new partnerships, some which we might not have considered before. And now is the time to be doing that creative thinking.
Great, thank you, Francis. I might ask Lena to come back and join me now, because we've got quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and yes, Lena, if you wouldn't mind helping me get through those questions. So thank you so much, everyone who's registered. I think we might have covered some that came in earlier.
Yeah, we have. I'll just start from the top quickly, because this is one that I can answer, about the statistics from so that's, does the 25% that use the arts for wellbeing have any major differences between arts practices? We ask that question in the attitudinal section. So, and it's based, yeah, so they're based on attitudinal statements. So while we can look at correlations between those who participate in each art form and their agreement with the statement, we can't say definitively, that definitively about certain art forms, but there is further scope to look into those correlations. So thank you.
We've got a question about biggest barrier in work around creative recovery is in the healthcare system, which is not able to recommend any alternative activities. And I think this might be what you were touching on, Ian. So the question is, has there been any movement nationally to implement the arts and culture for health and wellbeing among the primary and community health spaces? It sounds like in some areas maybe there's some progress, in other areas a lot of work to be done. That sort of sounds like what I'm hearing. So, a question for Ian from Bridget. Interested to know more about the measurement of the impact of programs upon the vets who took part. Was this mainly qualitative or also quantitative outcomes?
Sorry, this is all breaking up a little bit, but I got the gist of the question. Initially, Defence ran 2 pilot programs in 2015, and Defence psychologists ran a quantitative outcomes analysis from both programs, and it was actually due to the success of that they actually funded the ongoing funding for this program to continue. So initially they were quantitative, but one of the PhD students that we have, who is actually the creative director, he's a lieutenant colonel in the military, is doing a qualitative analysis, and that's the ones where we've had. He's been looking at the longitudinal studies of health and wellbeing. So just general wellbeing factors across. I can't remember what the scale's called, but it's general health and wellbeing factors that veterans are experiencing long after they've actually participated in the program.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. I've got a question here from someone who's really keen to understand how arts facilitators are considered in managing accidental counselling and care to the arts facilitator also. In community services, there's an understood process of supervision, and this person's keen to encourage the inclusion of a counselling service in a budget that not only includes the needs of participants, and also keen, sorry, a second part of that question, and also keen to address that groups often form family-like connections. So how is death and illness approached in the need for grieving and healing processes?
Do you have any thoughts on that one, Ian, or Francis?
Again, I only caught part of it, but I think around family, and again, I'll just use the analogy of teamwork really within the Defence program that we've been running is many of the Defence members that have come in, they're all volunteers. They all volunteer to come onto the program, and they all come onto the program as individuals, but they actually leave as a family. And we've found that even from 5 years ago, that we've created closed social media groups for each group of arts participants. And we've found largely there's been fantastic ongoing group discussions around the creative arts and sharing their creative arts as a Defence arts family. That may not have answered the question, but again, I'm sort of breaking up a little bit, so it's a bit hard to hear.
Sorry about that technical issue. Yeah, Francis, I'm going to ask, has that come up for you?
I was just going to add as well, I think we've learnt so much about the development of the custodianship program through our colleague Ian Collis, who leads that work, and a First Nations approach to leadership and custodianship, and particularly, you know, the strong connections that are being formed in that sort of closed space. So the way that the program runs is it's supported by 2 elders, and those elders also hold to the group through these difficult times. And I think often, you know, while there is a core facilitator for the program, the benefit of having the male and the female elder also keeping space for those program participants to be connected in that sort of a closed setting, but to be able to move to and from and support each other. It feels like even just in the short space of time that program has been running, it's in its pilot year at the moment, and they've had 1 residential before COVID shut everything down. It's been a really interesting journey, and I think the co-design and collaborative approach to the program content itself, but also the internal supporting of each other has been really amazing to hear through Ian how that's been working.
Thank you, Frances. There's a question here, and I'm not sure how much Ian and Frances, you can respond to this. It's about stigma and any tips from someone who is with an organisation and working with their employees. Any tips to break through what might be perceived stigma in people not being prepared to reach out and participate in workshops and other services? Did you catch that, Ian?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, that one. Obviously, we're doing work with not just Defence, but with the Australian Federal Police and emergency services. And what we find, obviously, with the AFP and Defence, there is a real stigma about being fit for duty. The essence of being in the military is that you're deployable. The essence of being in the AFP is that, again, you are deployable and fit for active service. So I did see, when I was talking a little earlier, I did see a question come up around, why don't we use art therapists? This wasn't a conscious decision, but we find that by using artists, that people tend to volunteer for the program because they're not going on a therapy, in inverted commas, a therapy program. They're just coming to learn arts and being able to tell their stories, and there's health benefits beyond that. But stigma is a real issue. I don't really have an answer about how to overcome stigma, other than making arts more mainstream. Over to you, Frances.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm interested to know what you mean by the word stigma around the idea of, like Ian talks about, like the art therapy sort of stigma attached to arts being a positive.
Just to give you the rest of that question, it's about due to people potentially not wanting to look like they aren't okay or aren't coping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a real thing, isn't it? Gosh, I think, again, I just come back to that idea of being transparent and asking people what they need to, whether that's in a closed space or whether that's with the rest of the group, what they need to participate, and making space and time for people to get to know each other. So we always have 2 or at least 3 residentials, because we acknowledge that the first residential is really just about building connections and building trust in a very slow way. And I think, I've seen participants in our program work through these things, and by the time they come to the second residential, which is maybe 4 months later, they're a very different person to where they were in the first residential. Much of what we hold really close to our, our cards close to our chest. We don't want to give away too much. There's this sense of imposter syndrome that encroaches into all of what we do, and looking around the room and feeling like, why am I here with all of these other people? So I think it's about space and time, really, to allow people to have that inward time to rest, reflect, ask themselves those questions first before they feel ready to ask others of the group, and and acknowledging that we do our best to create sort of safe spaces for this work to happen.
Thanks, Frances. I've just realised that we're sort of reaching the end of today's session, so I might wrap up here if that's okay with everybody. Thank you so much for this incredible discussion, and thank you to everybody for your questions, and we're very sorry that we haven't been able to get to them all. If you do have any other burning questions, or if you'd like to send your question through and we'll answer that separately, please feel free to keep in touch. If we could just get that email address back up on the screen, that would be great, but please send it through to the Australia Council Research Inquiries inbox, and we'll get back to you. And again, if today's discussion has brought up any issues for you, please remember that you're not alone, and to please access the contact details in the chat. And to come back to the full report to Creating Our Future, the National Arts Participation Survey, the full report is available online at the Australia Council website, as well as the individual Spotlight reports. And looking ahead to our next Spotlight webinar, which will be on economic value and future success, which you'll be able to register for now. It'll be on the 28th of October at the same time. Huge thanks again to Ian and Frances, Rebecca, and to our Auslan interpreters, and to all of those who have watched and listened and participated in this session. We're very grateful that you could join us, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.